The Train to Nowhere, and the First Hot Meal. April 29th, 1943, Hearne, Texas. The night air is warm and smells like creosote and wet earth as a long train grinds down to a stop beside floodlit fences, steel wheels screeching, steam and diesel hanging low over the cars. Inside one of the coaches converted for prisoners, Gefreiter Karl Fischer, thin from months of Tunisian dust and hunger, wrists still marked where rope bit during his capture, presses his forehead to the glass and watches men in American uniforms move along the platform with clipboards and lanterns, their voices calm, almost bored, as if unloading enemy soldiers is just another shift job. The door slides open and a wave of humid air rushes in, and for a moment Karl expects the familiar ritual of violence or humiliation, because every rumor in the Wehrmacht had painted American captivity as either softness you could exploit or brutality you'd survive, nothing in between. But the first thing that hits him is the smell. Coffee, real coffee, mixed with something heavier and comforting, like bread and meat, and it makes his stomach twist with a hunger he thought he'd trained himself to ignore. Rouse. Single file, a guard calls, not screaming, just stating, and the Germans climb down onto Texas soil, blinking at the light, seeing barbed wire, watchtowers, and then a sight that feels almost offensive in its normality. Orderly rows of wooden buildings, a mess hall, latrines, signs in English, and Red Cross parcels stacked like cargo. The Americans count them in, separate officers from enlisted, and march them through a gate where a painted board reads PW Camp. And Karl feels the strange sensation of being processed by a system that has done this before, because by this stage of the war, the United States is building a continent-wide network of camps, hundreds of them across almost every state, to hold the swelling numbers of Axis prisoners shipped across an ocean away from battle. Inside the receiving building, the routine begins. Names recorded, ranks confirmed, delousing, showers, and then soap, thick and white, handed out like it's nothing. Karl stares at it, the way a starving man stares at a coin, because soap in the field had become a memory, a luxury traded and hoarded, and now an enemy is issuing it as standard, the kind of small indignity that doesn't hurt the body, but scrapes the pride. A medic checks mouths and wounds with brisk efficiency, and Karl realizes with a cold, complicated shock that this is not charity. It's policy, rules written down, a Geneva-shaped bureaucracy that insists prisoners be fed and housed at a level comparable to the captor's own troops and allowed access to ordinary necessities through camp canteens. The mess hall is where disbelief becomes physical. Metal trays, steam, the clatter of utensils, and portion sizes that look like propaganda. Karl sits under a bare bulb with men he's marched with for months, and the first spoonful of stew is so hot it burns his tongue, but he keeps eating because the heat feels like proof that this is real. Around him, other prisoners eat too fast, eyes darting as if the food might be snatched away for being too generous, and one older sergeant mutters that it must be a trick, Americans fattening them for some purpose, because the mind prefers conspiracy to gratitude when gratitude feels dangerous. Later, Karl will learn the scale of it, the sheer administrative decision behind the tray in his hands. By the end of the war, the United States will hold roughly 425,000 German prisoners in about 700 camps, and at the overall peak in May 1945, the POW total in the U.S. will be over 425,000 across nationalities, with Germans the overwhelming majority. But on this first night, he only knows the immediate sensory facts: food that fills, soap that lathers, a blanket that doesn't smell like mold. And those facts collide with the last thing he remembers clearly before capture: ration cuts, muddy water, exhausted men sharing crumbs and telling themselves the Reich's shortages were temporary. The next morning, the camp's strangeness deepens, because the Americans aren't only guarding them, they're organizing them. A notice board lists work details for those eligible under the rules, and men talk about being sent to farms or mills, earning small pay, seeing civilian life beyond the wire in controlled ways that would have sounded impossible back in North Africa, where captivity meant removal from the world. In the compound yard, a baseball diamond begins to appear as if by accident. Chalk lines, a scuffed patch of dirt, prisoners improvising gloves, guards watching with the wary curiosity of men observing the enemy doing something almost American. And Carl stands at the fence trying to understand why a war can contain this. Barbed wire and sport, watchtowers and laughter, a German corporal learning the rules of a game he'd only seen in magazines. He notices something else too, something the food and soap can't hide. The complicated emotions that spread through the barracks at night, when men write letters on issued paper, comparing portions to what their families must be getting at home, wondering whether to describe the truth or soften it to avoid sounding like traitors, because being treated well by the enemy can feel like a moral trap. And outside the wire, the Texas landscape stays indifferent. Flat fields, distant towns, a sky so wide it makes the mind feel small. While inside, the camp grows into a miniature, regimented society that will eventually hold thousands of Germans at a time, one of the larger sites in the US program, and Carl begins to grasp the real shock of American captivity. Not comfort, not cruelty, but routine. An enemy powerful enough to feed you, wash you, and schedule your day, even as your own country's world narrows behind bomb craters and shortages. May 3rd, 1943, Camp Hearn, Texas. Carl Fisher wakes to a bugle he doesn't recognize, and for a second his body tries to sit up the way it did in a Wehrmacht tent line. Boots, belt, rifle. Then he remembers there is no rifle, only a bunk in a wooden barracks, a blanket that doesn't stink, and the steady hum of an American camp running on schedule. Outside, the compound is already moving with an almost humiliating efficiency. Roll call lines forming, guards counting without shouting, a notice board listing camp rules in neat English, while Carl's stomach, which had been a knot of hunger for months, now feels heavy in a way that is unfamiliar and oddly shameful. At breakfast, the tray is real again. Bread, something like oatmeal, coffee, and the older sergeant across from him mutters, "They're fattening us," as if belief in a plot is the only way to keep dignity intact. But Carl has seen the paperwork and the routine, and he begins to understand the deeper truth. This isn't kindness, it's compliance. An American system built around the 1929 Geneva Convention rules that insist prisoners be fed and housed to a standard comparable to the captor's own base troops, that the food ration be equivalent in quantity and quality, not because Americans love Germans, but because the US wants its own captured men treated the same way, and because a bureaucracy can be as relentless as a weapon once it decides to be. After chow, Carl is herded into another line. Camp processing never ends, and this time it's the canteen window, where he's told he can buy small extras with camp scrip, tobacco, writing supplies, maybe a candy bar if he's lucky, and the absurdity hits him like a slap. In North Africa, men traded cigarettes like currency because nothing else was stable, and now the enemy offers a regulated, priced market behind barbed wire. He takes a pencil and a small bar of soap again, still stunned by how ordinary it is. And back in the barracks, he watches his bunkmate begin a letter home on issued paper. Careful German script, pausing after every sentence, as if each word must be negotiated with shame. Do you tell your mother you are eating well when she may not be, or do you lie and keep her worry intact? Across the compound, a bulletin goes up announcing that Camp Hearn is a hub for POW mail distribution, postal service work done by the camp system itself. And suddenly, Carl understands why the Americans are so obsessed with forms and counts. Captivity here is not only fences, it is administration. A country large enough to hold hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers and still sort their mail like a factory sorts parts. The next shock arrives in the form of work details. Able-bodied enlisted men can be assigned labor under guard, often farm work in regions short on hands, and Carl hears the guard explain it in a matter-of-fact tone, like a payroll clerk. The detaining power is responsible for maintenance and the payment of wages. rules written down decades earlier and now applied in Texas dust. Prisoners talk about picking cotton, cutting timber, loading sacks, and the talk is not heroic. It's practical. How far the farm is, how strict the guard is, whether the farmer speaks German, whether the pay is enough to buy cigarettes and toothpaste. Carl's first trip out is surreal. A truck ride beyond the wire, the landscape opening into flat fields under a wide sky, and then a farmyard, where American civilians stare at them like strange livestock. The farmer, a middle-aged man with sun-cracked hands, doesn't spit or curse. He just points and talks to the guard, because he needs labor more than he needs vengeance. And by noon, Carl is lifting crates and sweating in a way that feels almost normal, the kind of physical exhaustion that used to mean end of day instead of end of life. On the ride back, he sees a roadside gas station, a billboard, a town with lights, and the distance from the front line becomes a kind of disorientation. Germany is burning under bombers, he's heard, and yet here the war feels like a rumor that hasn't arrived, except for the wire and the rifles. Back inside the compound, the camp's contradictions multiply. Officers walk separately as the convention requires, enlisted men form their own hierarchies, and politics seeps into the barracks the way dampness seeps into wood. Carl hears whispers about true believers, about prisoners who try to enforce Nazi discipline even in captivity, and he notices how men watch each other when guards aren't looking, because safety inside a camp can be threatened not only by the captor, but by your own side's fanaticism. The Americans, for their part, keep building normality like a fence, organized classes, church services, sports. And one afternoon, Carl stands at the edge of a rough baseball diamond, while guards lean on the rail and prisoners try to understand the rules of a game that seems ridiculous until you realize what it provides. Time passing without fear. A guard tosses a ball to a German who has never thrown one this way. Laughter rises, and for a brief moment the barbed wire becomes background instead of foreground. And that, Carl realizes, may be the most unsettling thing of all, because it tempts men into forgetting they are enemies. Yet even this Fritz Ritz, as some locals mockingly call such camps when they hear rumors of decent rations and soap, carries a dark undercurrent. Boredom turns into anger, anger into ideology, ideology into violence. And Carl senses it in the way certain prisoners speak about traitors and collaborators, in the way a man who works too willingly on an American farm is suddenly looked at differently back in the barracks. One night, he's jolted awake by shouting and the pounding of boots in the yard, and he lies there staring at the ceiling as guards run past, because the camp's calm is thin and can tear, and he understands that captivity in America is not a simple story of comfort. It is a complicated machine that feeds you, cleans you, and gives you a baseball game, while also trapping you in close quarters with the same fears and loyalties you carried from the front. By morning, the routine resumes as if nothing happened. Roll call, mess hall, work details, because that is what systems do. They keep moving. And Carl is forced to admit that the strangest weapon the Americans have aimed at him is not a rifle on a tower, but a relentless normality that makes him question what he believed about the enemy, even as the war back home grows more desperate. And somewhere ahead in the calendar, months he can't yet imagine, this uneasy mix of decent treatment and internal tension will collide, because when men are shocked by how well they are treated, the shame of it can become fuel, and fuel always looks for a spark. July 17th, 1943, Camp Hearn, Texas. The sun sits high and pitiless over the compound, baking the dust into a pale crust, while the guard towers throw sharp shadows like knife blades across the yard, and Carl Fisher is on a work detail roster when he hears the first rumor run through the barracks like a current. Someone has been dragged from his bunk at night. Someone has been beaten. Someone has been marked as a traitor. The camp's surface normality continues, mess line, roll call, canteen window, but underneath it the prisoner society is tightening into factions, because captivity doesn't erase ideology, it compresses it, and in a compressed space, the men who still swear loyalty to the Reich's leadership begin to police the others with an intensity that feels almost hysterical. Carl watches the way certain non-commissioned officers linger near the barracks doors, The way whispers stop when a particular man enters. The way work volunteers are eyed as if labor itself is betrayal. And he realizes the Americans can provide soap and baseball and Geneva-compliant rations and still not control what happens inside the German ranks when guards aren't in the room. In the letters corner, men write under a kind of double pressure, American censorship on the outside, German peer judgment on the inside. And Karl sees a prisoner tear up a draft because it sounded too grateful, because gratitude can get you labeled. The irony is savage. The camp system's regular meals and routine reduce desperation, but they also create a new moral battlefield, where some men feel compelled to prove they are still hard, still loyal, by punishing anyone who seems softened by captivity. In one barracks, a quiet man who admits he's glad to be alive is suddenly called a coward, and the word spreads like smoke. On the parade ground, baseball continues anyway, guards watching with the cautious amusement of men who don't fully understand the cultural war playing out behind the laughter, because to the Americans, sport is a pressure valve, but to the hardliners, it can look like surrender in miniature. Karl's own conflict becomes physical when he's assigned to another farm detail and comes back with an extra piece of bread the farmer pressed into his hand. He hides it in his jacket, then feels the weight of it like contraband because bread is not just food here. It's evidence, proof you interacted with the enemy as a person. And when he shares it quietly with a bunkmate, he does it like a crime. The Americans in their offices are running their own war within rules. They separate officers, they try to screen out the most fanatical men, they monitor camp newspapers and meetings, they rely on informants and German-speaking intelligence officers, because they've learned that camps can become ideological battlegrounds, not just holding pens. Still, control is imperfect, and when discipline inside the wire becomes violent, it sometimes erupts with the brutality of the front, just without uniforms. One evening, after lights out, shouting rips through Barracks Row and Karl hears running feet, the crunch of gravel, then a sickening thud followed by a chorus of voices, some pleading, some laughing, some commanding. And he sits up in his bunk with his heart pounding, because the sound is too familiar. Men surrounding one man. A moment later, a guard's whistle screams, floodlights snap on, and rifles bark orders in English as guards pour into the yard. But by the time they force the crowd apart, the damage is done. Karl sees, in the stark light, a body on the ground, bruised, limp, and the prisoners around it look away with the practiced blankness of men who understand collective guilt. The next day, the camp's American administration issues new restrictions, more inspections, altered schedules, tighter supervision, because that is how a bureaucracy responds to violence, by adjusting control variables. The prisoners respond in their own way, more secrecy, more coded language, more suspicion, because that is how close societies respond to being watched. In the mess hall, Karl listens to men argue about the Geneva rules as if the rules are weapons. One prisoner says the Americans must feed them well because the convention demands it. Another spits back that the Americans do it to show off, to humiliate Germany by proving they can afford to treat enemies better than the Reich can treat its own. And that thought lands hard because it contains a truth that hurts. The camp's regular rations are a mirror held up to Germany's shrinking world. Karl thinks of his mother in Hamburg or Bremen. He doesn't know which is being bombed this week. And the guilt sits in him like a stone, because he is eating steady meals while she may be rationing potato peels. And the shame can curdle into anger, and anger can be directed anywhere, even at the wrong targets. This is why some prisoners cling to ideology more tightly the better they are treated. Because if the enemy system looks competent and even fair, it becomes psychologically threatening to the story they were told about American decadence and weakness. Yet at the same time, other men begin quietly changing, not in a sudden conversion, but in a slow, unwilling re-evaluation. Karl meets a guard from Oklahoma who speaks a little German and asks him about Berlin with genuine curiosity, not mockery. And the conversation is awkward and small. Weather, food, farms. But it breaks something in Karl's mind, because propaganda had painted Americans as either brutal or stupid, and here is one who is neither. He watches prisoners attend English classes, not because they love America, but because language is a tool and boredom is crushing. And he sees a camp library with books that aren't censored in the way German reading has become. And he feels the dangerous pull of normality again, the sense that life can be more than slogans and orders. The Americans, too, are not saints. There is racism in the towns, resentment among locals, guards who take pleasure in small humiliations. But the overall system still runs on rules and routine. And routine is corrosive to fanaticism because it replaces heroic narratives with ordinary days. By late 1943, as Allied victories pile up and rumors filter in, Italy, the Eastern Front, U-boats lost, German prisoners begin to sense the war's direction, and that knowledge makes the camp's internal struggle sharper. The hardliners push loyalty harder, the doubters grow quieter, and the Americans begin shifting policy toward re-education and information control, understanding that the men behind the wire will eventually go home, and that what they believe when they leave may matter almost as much as what they did when they were captured. Carl lies awake at night listening to the distant sound of Texas crickets and the closer sound of men whispering in German, and he realizes the camps are not just places where the war pauses. They are places where the war mutates, turning into a contest over identity, shame, and the unbearable fact that an enemy's soap and baseball can sometimes hit harder than a punch. February 9th, 1944, Camp Hearn, Texas. The cold has finally eased into a damp, grey morning, and the compound smells of wet dust and coal smoke, as Carl Fisher is marched not to the work roster, but to a long, low building the Americans have labeled Recreation Hall, where folding chairs sit in neat rows like a church, only the altar is a screen. And a U.S. Army captain with careful German pronunciation tells the prisoners they will be shown a newsreel. The word newsreel makes the barracks men shift and mutter, because information is power inside a camp, and the hardliners hate power they can't control. Carl takes a seat anyway, feeling that same uneasy pull between curiosity and fear. And when the projector clacks to life, the room fills with the jittering light of battlefield footage, mud, tanks, ships, factories. America's war presented like evidence, not like a boast. And Carl senses what the Americans are doing. Not beating them, not starving them, but shaping the air they breathe. Because a prisoner who is fed and washed can still be fought psychologically. And by 1944, the U.S. Army has started treating the camps as more than storage. The captain doesn't preach in the way Carl expects. No screaming about democracy. He just lets the film run, then asks quiet questions afterward, as if the most dangerous thing for a fanatic is being forced to speak out loud in front of men who might disagree. Outside the hall, the camp routine keeps grinding. Roll call, chow, canteen. But it has a new layer now. Classes in English, arithmetic, even vocational lessons, and a camp newspaper pinned to a board, printed in German with clean type, reporting war news that doesn't match Berlin radio certainty. Carl watches men gather around the paper in clusters, some reading hungrily, some scoffing loudly for the benefit of others, and he notices how quickly the information becomes a weapon inside the wire. The doubters quietly trade facts. The true believers shout slogans to drown them out. The Americans, watching from a distance, learn which men glare the hardest and which men read the longest. The next week, Carl is assigned to a work detail again, cotton sacks and fence repair on a nearby farm, and the civilian world beyond the wire feels even more unreal now, because the farmer's wife offers them water in tin cups without flinching, and a teenage boy asks Carl, in awkward German, if Berlin is really as big as the pictures, and the question hits Carl like a punch because it's so ordinary. On the ride back, the prisoners talk about home, about Hamburg and Cologne, and the letters that come slower now. And Carl feels the shame sharpen, because the camp's steady meals make the contrast with home impossible to ignore. That contrast, he realizes, is part of the camp's psychological trap. If America can afford to feed enemy soldiers, what does that say about the Reich's promises? And the hardliners respond the only way they know how. They turn the shame outward, branding men who seem softened as collaborators, whispering about punishment, threatening in corners where guards don't see. One night, Carl is pulled aside near the latrine by a gaunt corporal whose eyes look too bright, and the man leans in close and says a name, someone who talks too much, someone who reads American papers. And Carl understands he's being invited into something ugly, a continuation of the war by other means, and he answers carefully, non-committal, because in a camp you learn that survival sometimes means speaking like fog. The next morning the Americans conduct a surprise inspection. Mattresses lifted, lockers opened, and the search isn't really for weapons. It's for control, for contraband papers, for coded notes, for the invisible infrastructure of intimidation. After that, the compound seems to split socially the way a front line splits terrain. Some barracks become louder with ideology, others quieter with weary realism, and Carl finds himself drifting toward the quiet men, not out of bravery but out of exhaustion, because the endless policing by fellow prisoners feels more suffocating than the barbed wire itself. The strangest part is that the camp's normal offerings keep expanding alongside the tension. Baseball games in the yard on Sundays, a makeshift orchestra practicing in a hall, church services where even the hardest men bow their heads because habit is stronger than politics. And Carl begins to see how the Americans are betting on time. Time plus routine plus information will erode fanatic certainty the way water erodes stone. One afternoon, he is assigned to an English class led by a civilian instructor under army supervision, a chalkboard and a battered dictionary, and the lesson is painfully simple. I am, you are, we are. Yet Carl feels something shift as he speaks the words, because language carries worldview, and learning the enemy's grammar is like admitting the enemy's world exists. Outside the classroom, a guard tosses a baseball to a German who has become oddly good at hitting, and for a few minutes the yard fills with cheering that is too human to stay ideological, and Carl hates himself for enjoying it, because enjoyment feels like disloyalty to men who died under his flag. That night he writes a letter home and stares at the page for a long time, then finally chooses the compromise so many prisoners choose. He says he is alive and treated correctly. He avoids the details of food and soap. He asks about family and says nothing about guilt, because the hardest part of humane treatment is how it complicates hatred, how it forces you to live with contradictions you would rather solve with a single emotion. By the time spring arrives, rumors of invasion thicken. Men whisper France, as if saying it might make it real. And Carl watches the camp's internal mood wobble. Some prisoners grow restless, convinced victory is still possible. Others fall silent in a way that feels like mourning. When news finally comes that Allied troops have landed in Normandy, the announcement lands in the barracks like a bomb without sound. And for days afterward, Carl hears men arguing about maps they cannot see, about armies they cannot join, about a war that is now moving toward their homes, while they sit behind wire in Texas eating steady meals. He realizes then that the camp's shock isn't merely material, food, soap, baseball. It's the psychological dislocation of being removed from scarcity and terror while your identity is still chained to a collapsing homeland. And as 1944 rolls into 1945, that dislocation will only intensify, because one day the guards' faces will change. The newspapers will speak of Germany in the past tense, and the prisoners will be forced to answer the question the camp has been pressing into them all along. If the enemy treated you like a human being, what will you do with that fact when you go home? May 8th, 1945, Camp Hearn, Texas. The morning begins like any other. Roll call lines, metal trays clattering in the mess hall, the sour-sweet smell of coffee. And then, sometime after noon, the camp's loudspeaker crackles, and a guard's voice reads an announcement in careful, formal words that sound almost unreal. Germany has surrendered. For a moment, the compound goes silent in a way Carl Fischer has never heard since arriving, as if even the wind pauses. And then the silence fractures into a chaos of reactions. Some men crying openly, others shouting that it's a lie, some laughing in a brittle, broken way that scares Carl more than anger. He walks back toward his barracks and sees hardliners already moving, already gathering, faces tight with rage and panic. Because a camp that held together by ideology and fear cannot easily survive the collapse of the ideology's promised victory. And when the Reich is gone, the men who enforce loyalty inside the wire suddenly look like criminals instead of patriots. The Americans respond with a system's instinct: extra guards, tightened restrictions, controlled gatherings, increased surveillance, because they know that defeat can be more dangerous than captivity, that men who have lost everything can lash out at the nearest target, and inside a camp the nearest target is often another prisoner. Carl watches as a prisoner who had been known as an informer, accused of cooperating with Americans, suddenly becomes a hunted man in the barracks, and the fear in his eyes is the same fear Carl saw in frontline retreats. Because the war's violence doesn't disappear with surrender, it simply changes scale and location. That night, under floodlights, the camp feels smaller and hotter, the fence is closer, and Carl lies on his bunk listening to men whisper names, whisper blame, whisper about what they will do when they go home, and what they will say about this place where they were fed and washed by an enemy. He thinks about the letters. He never dared to write honestly. The meals he ate while Hamburg burned, the baseball games that felt like treasonous relief. And he realizes surrender has turned those memories into a new burden. They are no longer temporary contradictions. They are the record of how he lived while his country died. In the days after VE Day, the Americans begin a different phase of the system. Processing for repatriation, political screening, intensified orientation sessions meant to show prisoners what Germany looks like now, what the camps and ruins and crimes look like, because the US Army has learned that releasing hundreds of thousands of prisoners back into a shattered Europe is not just transportation, it is a moral and political problem. Carl sits through briefings where officers speak of rebuilding, of denazification, of responsibility, and he watches men's faces. Some blank, some hostile, some quietly stunned into numbness. In the yard, baseball continues for a time, but the cheering is thinner now, because the game had been a way to pass time until return, and now return is real and frightening. Carl receives a letter, paper thin, ink faint, from a relative who survived bombing and displacement, describing hunger and cold, and he reads it 3 times, feeling the camp's steady rations turn into something almost poisonous in his stomach. Because now the contrast isn't abstract, it is written in family handwriting. He goes to the canteen and sees soap stacked in neat rows, and for the first time he feels anger at it, not because it exists, but because it existed for him while his home did not, and he realizes how complicated gratitude can become once the war ends. Gratitude can coexist with guilt, and guilt can turn into resentment, and resentment can be aimed at anyone, even the people who followed the rules. The Americans, aware of this volatility, keep the process tight. Medical checks, paperwork, rosters, because they need order more than sentiment, and because a system that held prisoners for years now has to reverse itself without chaos. Carl is assigned to a final work detail on a farm, and the farmer shakes his hand stiffly, not warmly, not cruelly, just as a man ending an odd contract, and Carl looks at the farmhouse and thinks about what it must have felt like for these Americans to watch enemy soldiers work their fields while their own sons fought overseas. A reminder that even humane treatment had an emotional cost on the captor side too. By late summer, Carl and thousands like him are moved again, trucks, trains, ports toward repatriation. And as he leaves Camp Hearn, he looks back at the watchtowers and the mess hall and the dusty baseball diamond and feels an unexpected hollowness, because the camp was a cage, but it was also a stable world in a time when stability was disappearing. On the journey back across the Atlantic, he hears rumors of Germany's ruins, of displaced persons, of shattered cities, and he realizes the camp's soap and food were not just comforts. They were a kind of insulation from apocalypse. And now the insulation is gone. The last night in the United States, he stands on a ship's deck, smelling salt and fuel again, and thinks about the first hot meal he ate behind wire, the first bar of American soap, the first time he watched a baseball arc into a Texas sky, and he understands that the shock of American camps was never simply that the enemy treated you decently. It's that decency forced you to carry more questions home, because brutality would have been easy to hate and easy to explain, while correct treatment under Geneva rules creates a messier memory, one filled with gratitude you don't want to feel, guilt you can't erase, and a strange awareness that even in total war, systems and choices still exist. When the ship finally turns toward Europe, Carl grips the railing and looks east into darkness, knowing that the next fence will not be barbed wire, but the ruins of his own country, and that the hardest captivity may be the one waiting at home, where he will have to live with what he learned in a place some locals called the Fritz Ritz, a nickname that sounded like a joke until you realized the joke was really about the war itself, how it could create a world where enemies shared soap and baseball under guard, and then send them back to rebuild the shattered world they came from.